And he thought, hey, let's bring the science to this discussion. Let's have a science-based, not a debate about all the pros and cons necessarily on whether or not we should have a reservoir on the Poudre, but let's talk about the ecology of this stream, what it is currently and what it might be in the future, given some projects that are proposed. And so that's the plan for this evening. We're going to have a panel. I'll introduce Leroy in a bit, and he can introduce his panel. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A after they present a little bit is the plan. So we want you all to plan to participate, think about your questions, and we'll have you come down and ask those questions as well. So here at the university, we talk about all things water all the time. So everything's on the table to talk about. But obviously we can't talk about everything all at once. And so tonight, we're talking about the ecology of this river. And when you think about the projects that are proposed, there are many dimensions to these projects besides the ecology. There's the financing, there's the human needs, there's the agricultural needs, municipal. There's many factors that go into decisions about infrastructure and how we're going to manage our society. And indeed, the environmental and ecological part of that decision is important. And of course, we know that to get this project permitted, and when I say this project, I mean Glade Reservoir and the Northern Integrated Supply Project, there's an environmental impact assessment that has to be done. In fact, there's an environmental impact statement and a supplemental that have been through a process here. And a number of CSU scientists, as well as local scientists, have been involved in looking at the science behind how these projects affect this river. And so we've got a really terrific panel here tonight. We have some ringers in the audience too, I see, as well. So I think we're going to have a lively discussion. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Leroy Path. Leroy is a professor in biology here at Colorado State University. He ran our graduate degree program in ecology for quite a while. He's been on the Water Center board. He's part of SOGIS. Leroy is very involved here at Colorado State University, and we're pleased to have him. Please help me welcome Leroy tonight.
Hello, welcome. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm going to give a few minutes of introduction, and then I'll introduce the panel members, and we'll go from there. Thank you for that introduction, by the way, Reagan. And so my name is Leroy Path, and I'm a river ecologist. I've been working on rivers for about 30 years in various places, and my focus has been on flow requirements of rivers to remain sustainable. And a tool called environmental flows has been something that I've worked a lot on in the last few years. I've been engaged in the scientific evaluation of impacts on water development in the Poudre River for at least 10 years, and very interested and very glad that we have this panel assembled tonight. The Poudre, as you know, is a working river, and it's been developed to meet both human needs and to meet human needs since the late 1800s. It has a modified channel. It has an altered flow regime. It's not a pristine system. It's impaired from numerous historical and current stresses, especially flow alteration due to diversion and channel stabilization. But it continues to function ecologically and provides the citizens of Fort Collins many highly valued ecosystem services and amenities. So the motivation for tonight's forum is to elucidate our scientific understanding of the current status of the river ecosystems, and its sensitivity to future proposed water development projects. The most immediate concern, of course, is the NISP. Its final EIS is expected in a few months, but other projects such as Halligan Reservoir and Siemens Reservoir expansions are also of concern. We know that the future health and integrity of the Poudre River ecosystem depends strongly on how we manage it from here forward. So proposed future water development in the Poudre presents strong challenges to sustaining the river ecosystem that we have today and the riparian ecosystem. The challenge is not unique to the Poudre. It's actually fairly common throughout the West and even to some extent globally, as increasing human populations are butting up against the needs of native ecosystems for fresh water. And the resolution of this challenge is what we might call, sort of academically, a wicked problem, one that lacks a simple, optimal solution to satisfy diverse and competing stakeholders. And I think we're also burdened with an additional challenge in this case, is that we're trying to, and this has been quoted before, I don't know who actually gets the original quote, probably Mark Twain, trying to solve 21st century problems using 20th century infrastructure and 19th century Colorado water law. So this is a very difficult problem. Okay, the science, though, underlying our understanding of the relationship between hydrology, sediment transport, and the river and riparian ecosystems is strong. And we know with reasonable certainty how the river geomorphology and ecology will respond to particular kinds of flow regime alteration. And a lot of that knowledge was captured and put together by an effort from the city of Fort Collins in this document, the Ecological Response Model. This was an effort by 8 experts, CSU scientists, I was one, some other members of the panel as well, along with federal scientists to look at the response of the Poudre River ecosystem to a variety of hydrologic futures, okay? So the very simple cartoon, is this what we need? The model was quite complicated, but this is a very simple distillation of that. Basically, at the top we have the hydrologic regime that feeds into the Poudre River. We've developed several scenarios of future hydrologic regimes. Those range from no, that's not what we want. Let me just stand up. Sorry about that. Okay, from a number of hydrologic futures, including the current hydrograph that we see in Fort Collins today, to water development, to scenarios having to do with climate change. And that hydrologic regime then was distributed throughout a long section of the Poudre River between Overland Trail and I-25, divided into several reaches. And in each reach, there are controlling factors such as winter base flow, summer high flows, height to the floodplain, that when water is run through those reaches, it results in ecological and geomorphic responses, such as the size and frequency with which the bed moves, or the riparian ecosystem, or fish production, okay? So it's a very confused system here.
Is the presentation mode not working, or what?
I don't know. We'll just stand here and try it. It was working earlier. Okay. So you see, it's basically input, transformation, and output kind of model. And we're going to talk about several of these green boxes tonight: channel structure, riparian systems, fish in particular, and wetlands. So obviously, the health and sustainability of the Poudre River ecosystem depends strongly on the hydrograph. And this is a hydrograph of the Poudre River reconstructed from historical data before there was any development in the basin, okay? But the same shape still exists. What we see, we can divide this into 3 areas. We have a sort of a low flow zone here, lower flows, river flow on the y-axis, sort of medium to high flows, and then high to very high flows. And at these very high flows, we will cross over into the floodplain. Now, each of these flow levels has certain functions that are important. Low flows provide wetted habitat for fish and invertebrates, and also for brown trout egg and fry survival over the winter. And Kevin and Ken will talk more about that. These medium flows, as the flow levels rise in the spring from snowmelt, certain geomorphic functions begin to occur. So these low to medium flows, we have silt being flushed from the stream bed surfaces, and that provides habitat for insects at slightly higher levels. We have gravel movement So coarser sediment begins to move, and that's good for fish spawning habitat, also for insect habitat. At even higher levels, we have movement of larger cobble-sized pieces that can rejuvenate the entire bed. So the bed can begin to move, and that creates a very important disturbance that rejuvenates all the habitat types in the system. And when water crosses over the floodplain, then we see, which doesn't happen very often, but that is very important in terms of maintaining the channel width. We have the river is full of water, the channel width is maintained, all the heterogeneity, the different kinds of habitat in the river are reworked and sustained. We get water on riparian trees, and new seedlings can establish. Wetlands get watered, and shallow alluvial groundwater begins to be stored. As the river levels drop in later summer, there's a characteristic rate of recession, and that rate is very important in terms of allowing cottonwood seedlings, for example, to keep up with the reclining water levels in the floodplain, so that they can survive. If the rate's too fast, they can't keep up, and the groundwater will discharge out of those alluvial aquifers, depending on how fast the water levels in the river drop. So we see that all of these components are important to think about the entire ecosystem. So with this background, tonight we're going to address questions really having to do with sort of three main areas. What is the current ecosystem condition, and what's the current trajectory of the river ecosystem under sort of a business as usual kind of hydrograph, sort of what we've experienced over the last 30, 40 years. How would proposed water development modify river and ecosystem functions, both in the near term and over the longer term, in terms of decades? Because this system takes a long time to respond to changes. And finally, are there mitigations to proposed water development that could help sustain the Poudre River ecosystem? In other words, mitigations that would allow the system to be self-perpetuating and not require sort of annual, mechanical or other kinds of management inputs in order to sustain some desired ecosystem state. And so the structure of tonight's panel will be basically each of the panel members will give 4 to 5 or 6 minutes of their perspective from their disciplinary expertise on the challenges facing the river and what may happen under proposed water development. There will be a panel discussion following that up until around 8 p.m. and then there will be question and answer period. And I would ask you, if you have a question, you come down to the front. We have a limited number of microphones here tonight, and I'll give you a microphone to ask a question, and you direct it to one panel member or two, and I'll follow up as necessary. So with that, let me introduce our panel members tonight in order of their presentation. So first we have Dan Baker here, who's an instructor in the CSU Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Next we have Kevin Bestgen, who's a research scientist in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. Then we have Ken Kehmeier, who's a senior aquatic biologist, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Next we'll have Marc Easter. Marc is an ecologist at the CSU Natural Resources Ecology Lab and chair of the Save a Poudre. And last but not least, Jen Shanahan. And Jen is a watershed planner with the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas. And she's been very involved in things like coordinating the development of the ecological response model and things like that. So everyone on this panel has many years of experience working in the Poudre and has scientific credibility to speak to the issues that face the river in the near and the long term. So with that, let me start with you, Dan. Grab that. That doesn't work too well.
All right, is that coming through? Do you need the? Oh, no, so I need both. Yeah. All right, double mic. Please work out. All right, can you hear in the back? That sounds pretty good. All right, thanks for being here tonight. My name is Dan Baker, and I have worked directly on the Poudre since 2012. I had a project where I took a look at monitoring after the fires of 2012 and then the floods of 2013 to try to get a better idea, mainly through the City of Fort Collins, what those two events meant to the river. So I got a lot of field time in the river. And then that also coincided with my work on the ecological response model. The other consultant, or I guess the consultant that had started that model, serendipitously left at the same time I came back from a postdoc back to Fort Collins, and Jen and Brian and Leroy and others were excited to find someone else to basically run the ERM model and kind of take care of all its intricacies. And then I also worked with the city natural areas and other departments across the city to help to develop the river health assessment framework, which Jen will probably talk a little bit more about that here a little bit later, but basically building a framework that we could help to grade the Poudre and what kind of condition it's in and look at this, how it evolves over time. So I'm an engineer. All my degrees have been in civil engineering, and so my specialty is more the water and the rocks and the physical type stuff. Although as any kind of river scientist, we have to cross over and communicate well with the biologists and the riparian ecologists and everything else. So that's kind of where my perspective and where I'm coming from on this topic. Can we talk about that, or you want to?
Sorry, just what just appeared on the screen shows the current Poudre hydrograph, and what we see are their highly reduced average peak flows, about 50% of what they were pre-development. Okay. And the other thing that's notable is that during the drier seasons, the winter and late fall, oftentimes we see the Poudre stream bed actually being dry because of depletion. So those are issues that we have to deal with currently in the Poudre, and so water management is layered on top of that.
All right, and that segues pretty well into what I'm going to be talking to as well, because my focus is actually going to be on peak flows. Right, so there's been, Leroy talked about that there's kind of these three different bands of flows: base flows, moderate flows, and peak flows. And essentially what this graph shows, across the bottom here are their daily average flows. And so if you think like the flood of 2013 was up here close to 8,000 CFS. If you went out there today, it's down here at about, I think, 50 or so, or even less currently. And so essentially, as we find more water in the channel, we create more what we call shear stress. And shear stress is just force per area. And so the deeper the water is, the faster it moves, the more stress it causes. And basically, the more function or the response of that shear stress is this kind of stair-stepping of different functions. And so what we have down here in this lower tier, kind of in this 1,500, 1,800 CFS flow, is where we have kind of superficial sand moving. Now keep in mind that I'm starting my discussion at probably the lower end of the bound, or kind of maybe even the middle of the middle flows up to the high flows. And so this isn't talking about the base flow, which is definitely important for the biology, but I'm focused more on the channel itself. And so we like to see, of course, these superficial sand moving and algae scouring. We like to see that about every year, right, to keep the channel kind of cleared out and keep the surface cleaned off. And then we start moving up into higher and higher levels of mobility. Now, mobility talks about both the size of the particles. It also talks about how well embedded those particles are, basically, how much power the river has to move the system. Now, sediment transport is a highly probabilistic process. Essentially, we can see sediment transport at some lower levels, but it's going to vary highly in both space and time. And so you might just see a few rocks moving here and there. As we get more and more stress in the bed, we're going to witness higher and higher levels of mobility. And so what we have over here on the left-hand side is this increasing likelihood of maintaining channel size. I'll talk a little bit more on my next slide. That's one of my big fears for the Poudre as we decide to remove more water from the system, is basically maintaining an effective stormwater conveyance mechanism to get water out of Fort Collins. And so to contrast with these functions, or to kind of give you some more context about these functions, if we take a look at historic data versus model data that is used for the Northern Integrated Supply Project, anybody interested in the technicalities, this is actually gauge data from the Lincoln Avenue gauge. This is model daily data that was produced with the supplemental draft EIS, which came out here a couple years ago. And so what this looks at is the number of times that we reach these levels of function across those two different hydrographs. I could show you a dozen or 20 different modeled hydrographs depending on all these nuances. But I just picked these two because basically one of them shows what has happened in the past over the last, well, basically from 1980 to 2006, and these are water years. And the other one shows in that same period of time what NISP would have produced. And what you see in general is we see a reduction of these events. When you see a reduction of events, it means not only that they happened less in total, but it also means they happen less often, right? And some of these events are very important to have every few years, or basically we need to rejuvenate things on some kind of time interval. And we're not going to talk a lot about recurrence interval tonight, but my second slide, in the interest of time, I'm seeing that Leroy's showing me I've used most of my time up, is these are the main points. Currently, we do have the peak flow conditions that are capable of maintaining our current ecosystem, right? Not the ecosystem we had 100 years ago, but the current river that we have today. But as sediment transport is a highly nonlinear relationship with flow, by dropping down the peak flows, we're going to start losing some of these functions to do the following items: scouring algae, moving sediment, and maintaining the channel size. So these are basically on increasing amounts of flow. So reduced aquatic habitat quality due to fine sediment accumulation simply means that we won't have the energy of flow through Fort Collins to move the sediment that comes down basically out of the canyon. Currently is shuttling through Fort Collins. It's going to start depositing. We're going to start seeing that over time. We'll also disconnect the river from its riparian forest. And my biggest point on this, my biggest fear, is that we're going to start seeing increasing flooding risk as we miniaturize this channel because it doesn't have the flows to maintain its current size. It's going to be miniaturized due to both sedimentation and also the encroachment of vegetation kind of laterally. We still will get large floods. We still will have the September 2013 type events. But if we have a much smaller channel, that channel will not have the capacity to move that water out of town. We'll basically be in a similar situation that Greeley is now, but that'll be coming up here into Fort Collins. So that was my main points to make, and I will hand it down the line.
Thank you, Dan. Next, we have Kevin Bastian to speak about fishes.
Thanks, Leroy. So I'll use Leroy Path's fine summary slide to try to make a little bit of a segue here. My name's Kevin Bastian. I'm in Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology on campus here. We run a research lab where we specialize in understanding native fish ecology and conservation, particularly in streams that are altered by stream flows and habitat. I've done that for the better part of 30 years and worked in the Poudre system since 1992 during monitoring sampling between Fort Collins and Greeley. And so I know a lot about the river and its habitat and the fish assemblage and changes that have happened over time. Just like to point out that this is a great slide because it integrates a lot of the functions, at least the physical habitat functions, that the Poudre undergoes during this merry-go-round ride, low flows here, way up on the peak, and just all the functions that happen in between, important for setting the physical template of habitat. And I'm going to show you, by deconstructing this slide a little bit, where the fish plug into that, and that this whole hydrograph is really important in the life history of these fish. So there is our deconstructed hydrograph, highest when spring melt goes on and low in base flow periods. Brown trout start the year off pretty well by having fish in the spawning gravel already at the first of the year. They spawn in October, November, December. So the base flow period provides important habitat for brown trout incubation and egg function, beginning again in late fall, early winter, into the early parts of spring even in some years. That base flow also provides important habitat for the rest of the native fishes. You got to remember the Poudre River is very small this time of year. Fish are compressed into a very small habitat space. So these base flows are really, really important for lots of the species, all of the species that live in the Poudre River. As you go up the hydrograph during the spring period, other native fish begin moving around to spawn, things like Iowa darters, Johnny darters. Rainbow trout start moving and spawn in early spring, and eventually hatch out just prior to spring peak flows or around spring peak flows. So a lot of fish is just going all over the hydrograph in terms of important life history events. We go down the recessional limb of the hydrograph. Most of our warm water native fishes spawn then. Important functions during that time after these fish spawn, base flows providing stable, steady flows, lots of nutrients for young fish to grow and get big enough to survive over winter. And again, brown trout kind of finish out the year, spawning in this late October, November period, and very dependent on things that happened months and months ago. This peak flow up here provides clean spawning gravel, movement of silt out of substrate for all these native fishes that spawn on this recessional limb, as well as providing interstitial spaces for water and oxygen flow so that they can have a successful life history in the Poudre River. So let's talk a little bit now about the Poudre River fish assemblage through time. The middle, or the tallest green column, and the species don't really matter. There's 28 native taxa in the Platte River Basin historically in front range streams, not plain streams, but front range streams are listed here. And these are the taxa all indicated with green dots. The Poudre River has a subset of those, 22 native fishes known in all. And so a subset of those historical fishes. We now know that only 12, about half of those native fishes, are in numbers now that we can call as stable or relatively widespread populations. The ones in red have been extirpated, no longer occur in the Poudre. The ones in yellow are ones that we think are declining to the point where they are probably going to go away at some point in the future. Things like common shiner up here that are gone from the Poudre River, they rely on those high flows, even though they don't spawn then, to create clean gravel habitat in which to reproduce. Things like my favorite fish in the whole river, Plains top minnow, really diverse habitat, floodplain wetlands. So when the river gets out of the banks, creates floodplain wetlands, that's where Plains top minnow will go. Also in-channel main stem backwater habitat created by highly functional flows that create complex channels. Those are places where Plains top minnow like to live. So lots of fish, lots of things going on in the Poudre River, but that's a declining fish community over time for lots and lots of different reasons. Things like altered stream flows, reduced stream flows, lack of connectivity up and down the stream channel is a big one. We got lots of diversions in the Poudre River, so fishes can't move freely up and down the channel. Toxicants are another big one, non-native fishes, invasive species, causing declines in some of these fishes. So a multitude of reasons for why these fish have declined over time in the Poudre River Basin. So just to wrap this up a little bit, I hope I've impressed upon you that all these hydrograph elements are important for these fish, base flows as well as the highly critical peak flows. Peak flows create habitat. They scour habitat, they move the river around, they rejuvenate the substrate, providing a lot of physical habitat, the template upon which these fishes make their living. There have been many insults to the system causing this kind of reduction in the fish community. Most of our specialist fishes are gone, the generalist ones remain. So we're working with really a very impaired fauna at this point in the river. So we can call this kind of, in the patient analogy, the patient is ailing, it's sick and probably declining. Half of the native species are left. We talk a little bit about, saw in the paper the other day about these conveyance flows through Fort Collins. That's certainly going to help the fish community within the city of Fort Collins. But if those flows go away just downstream of Fort Collins, the Poudre River and all of these fishes that live down there are not going to do very well. Oops, I went back and I want to do that. So things are declining in the Poudre River, and my conclusion here is that more development in terms of more water extraction is not necessarily going to help this fish fauna that's already impaired. Even though things like base flows will do good things, we need to continue with high peak flows, base flows throughout the river, and to have this fully functioning ecosystem. That's all I have.
All right, thanks, Kevin. We can follow up on that in the discussion period. So next speaker, panelist is Kehmeier, Parks and Wildlife.
I've been associated with the Poudre River since, 1978 when I came here as a student. There were still cars that were part of the banks of the river in downtown Fort Collins. So from some standpoints, the Poudre's in a better situation than it used to be. So it's not all as bleak as it could be. But most everything I was going to say has been said already, except for the fact we at Parks and Wildlife kind of look at the ecological response model, but we flip it over because I understand the food pyramid better, and so I can understand this a little better. But what you see here is geology and climate drive the hydrology, and then hydrology drives hydraulics, which is a transport of water down and on the floodplain and through the sediments. Then you go into geomorphology, and that's transport of wood and created bed forms and dynamic equilibriums. And then physiochemical, the water quality that we see in the Poudre right now is heavily degraded from what it used to be, which is another variable on those native fish that Kevin talked about. And lastly is the biology that sits at the top. And from our standpoint, if you're coming in here and you got goals and objectives to fix this biology part, somehow these have to get fixed to a point that you can get ecological lift up here at the biology level. This is a program that was brought forward by Stream Mechanics. Will Harmon out of North Carolina sort of came up with this approach. We like it because we can set goals and objectives for projects, and we can measure ecological lift when projects are done. So this is sort of the way we've approached this. Similar to a lot of these guys, the flood in 2013 sort of rattled our cages at my agency as well, because we're involved with every river along the Front Range. Those brown trout that are in the river, those native fish in the river, that's the biologist's job at Parks and Wildlife to try to juggle that, because we have people that want sport fish opportunities in the downtown Fort Collins, because it's one of the heavier used parts of the river now. But we also got to consider those native fish, and how do we do that? Because those brown trout are very piscivorous, and they eat fish for dinner most nights. What we've seen on the Poudre and in other North Front Range streams since 2010 is sort of an increase in the cold water species going down the river. Those cold water species are brown trout and long-nosed suckers that we keep track of. But if you look at this, you're seeing an increase in the trout or the cold water species moving downstream, and you're seeing a decrease in the native species stuff. Why is that happening? We're not real sure. We're dependent on Kevin to help us get an answer. One of the theories is that because since 2010 we've been in a fairly high water cycle. We've had high water years in 2011, 13, obviously most of us remember that, 14, 15, all of these have been good water years, and so we've increased base flows. And so you're seeing flows go farther down the river, farther into the wintertime. And what we've seen is those high flows may be pushing brown trout downstream during the high part of the water cycle. And when they get downstream, it's pretty good until the water drops. Then they got to figure out how to get back upstream. And what do? They run into that diversion that Kevin talked about. That longitudinal connectivity of that river is really important for fish migration up and down the river. From our standpoint, these fish shouldn't be located in one 5-mile stretch of river. They should have access to the entire river. And so one of the things that we'd like to see is more fish passage on these structures to allow fish to move up and down the river more frequently. So if brown trout are down here during the winter because it's warmer and there's things to do, but then during the summer they can work their way back upstream, that's probably a good thing for the native species, for the brown trout and those other species. So, but as you can see down even here by timberline, you're seeing the cold water species, and you see the brown trout in the green dotted line. They're going up since 2010. Natives are going down. And that's sort of the whole process that we're seeing in the river. We're seeing the exact same thing in the St. Vrain River, which is probably the last banyan of habitat for a bunch of the native species that Kevin talked about in the Platte Basin. So those are concerns from our standpoint, is that longitudinal connectivity. Unlike Dan, I worry about high flows. The problem with a fish biologist is you ask him which is more important, low flows or high flows, and you say yes. Because high flows are important for the habitat that those fish in, but low flows my only response to that is fish need water 24/7, 365. And if you've been over the Poudre River in the last couple of weeks, that's pretty tough for those fish to make a living.
Great, thank you, Ken, and there'll be opportunity for questions, and if you want to follow up on any of that later. Next is Marc Easter.
All right, thanks, Leroy, and thanks for inviting me to be involved tonight. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Great to see such a big turnout here tonight. So much interest in what we're talking about tonight. And, you know, if you get a bunch of scientists up here talking, you're going to get PowerPoints. And so sorry for that, but you're going to get them from me, too. So I'm an ecologist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab here at CSU. During my day job, I do greenhouse gas inventories in agriculture and forestry, and I try to figure out what the greenhouse gas burden is associated with food production, like what's the total burden associated with growing a tomato or a chicken or a gallon of milk, that sort of thing. And so that's my day job, but after 5 and weekends, I work on, I'm the board chair of Save the Poudre. I'm one of the founders, along with Gary Wachner, John Bartholow, Gina Jeanette, and Greg Spear. We formed the organization in 2008 as a science-based organization to protect and restore the Cache-la Poudre River, and we formed it directly in response to proposals for the Northern Integrated Supply Project. And my role within the organization has primarily been to advance the science around assessing what the potential impacts on the river are from proposals for water diversions like NISP and others that are proposed for the river right now. In 2008, the draft environmental impact statement was released by the Corps of Engineers for the Northern Integrated Supply Project. And Save the Poudre went through that with a fine-tooth comb. One of the pieces that we analyzed was the predictions around wetlands loss. And what was being predicted in the document seemed kind of low to us. We tried to vet the numbers and we couldn't, because we found out there was no wetlands map available for the Poudre River, other than something that had been done in the 70s and had been printed onto vellum in the 1980s. Hadn't been digitized. We didn't really have any way to analyze it in an effective way. So we decided, well, let's go produce a map. So we went and talked to colleagues at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Joanna Lemley and Eric Carlson, about digitizing a map of the wetlands in the Poudre River watershed below the canyon. And they said, sure, yeah, we'd like to do that. So we went out and raised the money, put them to work, and it took them just short of 2 years to do the work. They did an outstanding job and put the maps out to peer review, and then after peer review made some adjustments, and then it's registered in the National Wetlands Inventory now. So it's the base wetlands map that's available for anybody. Anybody, you can download it for free and use it for scientific research or other purposes. So once we had that map, we wanted to do an assessment of what the potential impacts of stage reductions, essentially diverting water flows from the river, would be on wetlands. And I don't need to, you've had a great introduction, much better than I could give, about what the importance of those peak flows are. I'll just add to it, one of the key functions that they provide is recharging wetlands and supporting riparian vegetation, those gallery forests that you see, the cottonwoods, box elders, and others along the river. So this diagram here shows essentially a map of the river. And can you see the mouse? Okay, good. So down here, this is essentially a cross-section of the river. It's intended to represent a cross-section of the river, and it's just really a model. It's not to scale. But this shows the Poudre River down here, and then this is essentially the stage level above normal base river flow here. And I'm showing an example up to about 8 feet here. And it also shows wetlands along the river and their position relative to the base flow. And what you see here, this wetland right here, it's pretty close to the river, it's relatively low elevation. It's going to get flooded pretty much every year. This wetland here, about 4 feet above or less, it's going to get flooded less frequently, but more often than the wetlands you see up here at 5 and 6.5 feet above the river stage. So we were interested in assessing what's the impact of diverting the flows, of losing the peak flows on these wetlands along the river, scattered up and down. There's thousands of acres of them. So we hired Gretchen Peterson from Peterson GIS. She's a local GIS specialist and did excellent work with us. John Bartholow and I worked together with her to design some experiments. We consulted with a number of colleagues here at CSU and in the larger Fort Collins community around designing the assessment. Gretchen superimposed a digital elevation map on our wetlands map, and then we said, okay, what happens if you remove 6 inches of water from the peak flow, and then a foot, and then 1.5 foot, and then 2 feet, and so on. And in the end, we ended up producing this slide here, which it's essentially a model of what the probability is that wetlands are going to be affected at stage decreases. So what we found was that post-NISP, these wetlands that are above about 4.5 or 5 feet relative to the Poudre River normal flow would very rarely receive flooding flows and would likely degrade. And so we'd lose the important ecosystem functions associated with these wetlands: cleaning water, habitat. There's obviously a lot of recreational benefits that we see with it. They're the highest value ecosystems we see in the basin right now. The net impact was that up to about 2,100 acres of wetlands and riparian areas would be degraded if NISP were built. And you see this important loss of habitat, worsening water quality, and additionally up to about 190,000 metric tons in carbon dioxide equivalents in ecosystem carbon would be lost to the atmosphere from this. So we see this as pretty important at a time when we're losing wetlands across the nation for a number of different reasons. And where we have a shared resource, the atmosphere, that we depend upon, and a climate that is at risk due to, well, you all know the reasons for it, climate change. We see the sustainability of the Poudre River extends not just to the wetlands we see in our watershed, but its potential contributions to the atmosphere as well, too. So I'll go ahead and close with that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mark. And the last panelist to speak will be Jen Shanahan from the City of Fort Collins.
Hi there, can you hear me? So I'm a watershed planner for the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas Department. I've worked there for 11 years, approaching 11 years. And I have been involved with the Poudre River most of that time. In the last 5 years, I've really focused more and more of my time increasingly, exclusively on this topic. My job is to help sustain the health and resilience of the Poudre River. So with that, I work on efforts, internal communication efforts, external science communication efforts, science collaborations, such as those that you've heard of already tonight, and all of which come together to support the health and resilience. And when I talk about resilience, I really think about supporting the average year ecosystem, the ecosystem during the average year flows, and all the functions that occur during those normal years. But then I also think about resilience during the extremes, so during the droughts and the large floods. So we used to have, without any urban development, there was a river that would self-adjust. The river can't adjust in most places, and so we have to pay much closer attention to how to manage this river for the large, to maintain capacity for the large floods, as well as having water consolidated in a single place for the very low flow years for fish and channel capacity, as Ken and Dan spoke about. So the city, Leroy asked us to talk about our involvement in the EIS process, and the city has taken a very proactive stance in trying to understand the river and understand what we want for the river. But we've also just been engaged as a member of the public in the environmental impact statements, or the process, the formal regulatory process. So we've submitted substantial comments, and those are all available on the internet and on our website to see. So let's go ahead and move into the riparian area. Whoops. Funny things happen when you move from one computer to another. So how does this riparian system work? On the Poudre River, there are really 3 drivers, and they're supposed to be lined up there to the 3 pictures, of course. So we may think of flows as the sole driver, the most important driver, but on the Poudre River, there are really 3 sort of almost equal drivers, and so it's flow, topography, and species. But everything starts with flow and ends with flows. So the riparian system needs water in a different way than wetlands. It needs to be saturated for a short period to help the riparian species grow and thrive in the springtime when they are growing at their greatest rate. But it also keeps out other species, and it makes the riparian system unique. So shorter duration but saturated flows is what matters to the riparian system. So these are peak flows. Throughout the rest of the year, the flows in the river are correlated with the groundwater, and shallow groundwater is also part of what the riparian species, vegetation species, need. So the base flows can matter and do matter, but not nearly as much as the peak flows. So wetlands need longer sustained saturation, 2 weeks or more. As I mentioned, riparians, they need a quick pulse at a minimum, but they can also sustain, they can thrive in a longer wetted environment. Now in the Poudre, the topography is greatly altered. It's natural in the canyon for the river to have a very narrow riparian system, riparian forest. But once you get out of the canyon, here on the Front Range, these rivers would sort of tumble out of the river, lose a lot of energy, and wind very broadly across the floodplain. Today, largely because of gravel mining, but also because of roads, bridges, and urban development, but cobble mining has been the driver of this limitation. The river is confined by a lot of levees, and so its area to be actively engaged or naturally functioning with the river is greatly limited. And I would say it's second to peak flows, it's the greatest limitation, and it limits the potential for flows to benefit the riparian system. And then lastly, there's species. So the native species function well with, and they rely on disturbance. And yet without this disturbance, we are seeing an increase in other species. But even with the disturbance, we have certain species that have come from other continents that take up the resources that the vegetation, the native vegetation needs. So the one that comes to mind the most on the left here is crack willow, and it gets established and it never leaves. It cracks and it basically drops a baby. So it's very hard to eradicate, but it's not one of our primary focuses when we are working on vegetation, because there are noxious species out there that we're focusing on more. But as far as function, there are some woody species like crack willow that are really limiting the current condition of and function. But there's other functions the riparian system has as well, and that is just holding down the bank, limiting or managing the erosion, the natural erosive processes, so that they are sort of mitigated and slowed. But also the riparian system functions as a filter for any pollutants or flushing stormwater flows that can come in from the upland. And this is especially important in urban areas as we get flashier and storms that come off of our hardened surfaces quicker and quicker. So what might happen with change in flows? And I'm talking about flows here more generally. We're talking about NISP, but there are a lot of, NISP is sort of the big elephant in the room, but there's a lot of baby elephants behind NISP. And I think it's important that we focus on what are the flows and what are the functions we want, and then how do we get there, so that we're not just focusing on a single project, rather collectively as a community, how do we work towards what the river needs. But there are direct and gradual changes that I would expect, and that's simply a narrowing of the system. But then there's also threshold changes where the system narrows, and then you see this switch to suddenly there is an inability of the native riparian species to dominate, and then you get a more upland type system. And ultimately, what you can have is then no vegetation along the riverbank, which leads to a very vulnerable river in larger floods. The other aspect to riparian systems is that they can move into the channel, as has been mentioned, and this vegetation encroachment within the channel is a different kind of concern. Without large floods that are there to scour the vegetation within the channel, this vegetation establishes within very few years. It's very hard to get out, and you see this in islands that you see along the river. So mid-channel islands that are just sort of permanent. They're permanent fixtures, and they reduce the size of the river channel and then the capacity of the river to maintain, to hold these floods, which helps the community in the sense that the community needs the water to stay within the riparian zone and in the channel. And just to walk you through, the image that I have up there is from a very simplistic analysis, not simplistic, but it's an analysis in one point in space here, just below LeMay, that shows the yellow line is the current 5-year floodplain, and the 5-year flow is something that we look at as an index for riparian flows, and then those flows following NISP, that 5-year floodplain really barely makes it over the bank in that area. So this is just one example, but this area would be greatly impacted by the narrowing effect. And that's all I have.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Jen. And thanks to everybody, Thanks, Jen, and thanks to everybody else who had a chance to speak here. And of course, everyone was given a 5-minute, sort of target time, and I was the first one to violate that. So we want to have some discussion. I think there's some really interesting points and important points that have come up during this presentation that deserve a little bit more back and forth between some of the panel members. I'm also aware of the time constraints we're operating under tonight. So let me just informally at this point just ask by a show of hands if you have a specific question that you would like to ask of the panel. Then that's not going to occur for another 10 minutes or so, just to get a sense of how long we can continue this. Would you raise your hands, please, if you do? Okay. It's not a commitment, just sort of like you think you might. All right. So I think we had a little bit of time to have a conversation here. So let me start this by asking Ken and Kevin in particular to comment on what has recently been proposed by Northern Colorado Water District, the builders of NISP, the so-called low-flow conveyance refinement, which is now, as I understand it, officially a part of the proposed operational scheme of NISP, which would, in effect, and some of you may have seen this in the Colorado one yesterday, would in effect actively divert water back into the river during low flow periods to prevent the river from drying up, and would sustain a projected, or proposed to sustain 18 to 25 cubic feet per second in the river at all times. It would run through Fort Collins down to LeMay, I believe, at which point it would be sucked out of another pipe owned by Northern and then join the rest of the diverted water and head out onto the plains. So clearly we've seen the damage done to the river from low flow depletions through the city, and that has been identified, the low flow has been identified as one of the critical limitations for the Poudre ecosystem. And Ken, you mentioned, that rivers, fish need water 24/7 through 65, so this presumably would satisfy that requirement. You also mentioned that this sort of longitudinal connectivity upstream, downstream, and sort of habitat isolation through dewatering. And so I'm wondering two things. What do you think the effects, what do you see as the benefits of that conveyance proposal, and how concerned would you be that it stops at LeMay Avenue and the rest of the river is not included? I understand you have jurisdiction over the whole length of the river. So, oh yeah.
From the standpoint of upstream of LeMay, the proposal, the conveyance proposal does have some merit from the standpoint of keeping water in the river. And it's an additional 18 to 25 CFS to whatever else is in the river at that point in time. Right now it'd be 18 CFS. Part of the issue is that will become available when the project is built out. In other words, the participants this is a regional participant-driven project, and so those flows wouldn't be realized right off the bat as they got their permits and their construction contracts and things like that. So it would be a building process as you went through. Downstream of LeMay, that is a concern from the standpoint of the native fish component that we have down there. You know, the whole discussion with Jen talking about the narrowing channel, if you talked flushing flows or a peak flow in Fort Collins to make it work for the Fort Collins channel, you go to Greeley and that puts a bunch of Greeley underwater. So this channel has already retracted itself to a smaller state because of the amount of water that flows down it. So the difficult thing here is, how do we get water past LeMay, and how do we make that available to the fish down there? And one of those things that we would talk about is that fish connectivity that we talked about. City of Fort Collins and North Poudre Irrigation have done a nice job with some of the designs from our agency to come in and put a fish passage structure on the Fossil Creek Inlet ditch, and we actually tested that with tagged fish and things like that, and so we know that these fish will use those. And so I think that's an important piece of this is if you give those fish connectivity, that they'll be able to move up and down the stream as they need. I'm not sure how you go about increasing water downstream of LeMay at this point in time. As you said, we're working with an 1872 water law. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the law, there's nothing in there that says anything about the environment. And that becomes a difficult point.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, did you want to follow up on that in any way?
Yeah, sure, just real fast. I mean, I guess the increase in base flows, it would be welcome in terms of bolstering the fish community for as long as those flows last. That was in fact one of the strongest pieces of actual empirical data we had when we built the ecological response model was brown trout reproduction data that was much increased when winter base flows were higher. We got that data from our own monitoring work and found that was a really strong driver, and not coincidentally that those suggested flow levels are kind of in the target area of what Ken and others have talked about and where we talked about in that model. My concern is that we have brown trout everywhere. Native fish don't necessarily live everywhere, and the Poudre River would just suffer another insult downstream. It's already severely impaired. Those fish communities are already reacting to really low base flows this time of year and would be further degraded. So tough problem and a trade-off, and I think one that has been underemphasized in the proceedings talking about additional water development and what those other impact areas might be, such as downstream of that convey zone.
Did anybody else want to have a comment on that? I have. Let me follow that up a little bit and say that currently the proposal, the NISP proposal, it does have the low flow conveyance add-on to it, so that's apparently part of the deal now. But there's nothing in the EISs having to do with any kind of high flow or any post EIS announcement having to do with high flow, any specific high flow mitigation. I understand there are some conversations occurring and that Northern may have something to say about this publicly in a month or so, but right now we don't know. But I would just like to ask maybe Dan, assuming that high flows are modified in the way that we've seen, proposed in NISP, and this low-flow conveyance were to be accepted or approved and implemented, what is your opinion or your judgment on how effectively the new sort of high-flow regime under NISP would be able to sustain the quality of that conveyance habitat? In other words, you have a section of river through the city which has a constant low flow, base flow guarantee, but would you have the high flows necessary to sustain that habitat quality over, let's say, 30 years? Or would, or is some kind of mechanical intervention going to be required in order to rework the gravel beds and so forth? I mean, we don't know the answer precisely to that, but I would just like to hear your opinion on that, because as we heard Ken say, high flows are also important for the river, for fish habitat in the river.
So one of the things that we learned in the supplemental draft EIS process was that basically downstream of I-25, we're seeing a lot of deposition of sediments. Essentially, we're going from a transport phase to a more depositional phase in the river. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, we'd anticipate that that would move its way upstream, and so we'd start to see that depositional processes happen in Fort Collins versus downstream of Fort Collins. So I think we'd certainly see a change in the overall habitat over time, just because mainly we're going to be seeing a lot finer deposits, a lot more sand, fine gravels, a lot more sands and silts that will even infiltrate down into the coarser bed, and basically kind of to change the overall, at least the surface structure. And I think then that combined with a shrinking channel that would just have less habitat overall. So I can't really speak to the habitat. Diversity would likely decrease. That's a little bit harder question, but certainly the volume of habitat would be reduced. You showed a graph of different flow levels that do different functions in terms of sediment movement and maintaining the channel width. Do you have a guess or a thought as to what level of flow would be needed in order to keep those spawning gravels open over long periods of time when there's sort of sediment accumulation occurring in the background? So this is a question you probably couldn't ask some of the other panelists up here because it'd be too political, but as a scientist working here for the university, the models, so particularly the ERM model, we put a lot of analysis into the numbers. We found that somewhere around like 3,000, 3,500 CFS should give a pretty good probability of maintaining those habitats and those functions over time.
Did anybody want to follow up on that? Ken?
One of the things that Save the Poudre has noted in its comments on the DEIS and the SDEIS is that with the loss of those peak flows and the deposition of these fine sediments in the river in Fort Collins, that it's likely to make the city more vulnerable to flooding risk because the city wouldn't have the conveyance capacity. It'd have less volume in the river channel to address the big floods that we're likely to see. And when those big floods come down, the diverters, the irrigation operators, the diversion dams, and NISP would not be operating because it's too dangerous to the equipment. So I think that's something that I just wanted to put that idea out there and get that on the table.
We, through the help of some people that work with Marc at times, have kind of compiled a list of studies that have been done on the Poudre from I won't call it a flushing flow because it's such an altered system. I'm not sure we could call it a flushing flow. Maybe effective flow. What flow is the most effective to mobilize different types of substrate to move it downstream? And it's all over the board. There's stuff depending on if you want to move, there's some of the stuff that shows it's down around 500-600 if you want to mobilize some sand in places. But if you get up into cobbles, it's up where Dan was talking. So that's the hard thing when you're dealing with this from a I'll say at a political standpoint, because the flushing flow into this pyramid is really where the whole crux of the matter shows up, because that's when the water's available for those people that have the water right to move the water into their system. But it's also the time of year that we need it for habitat refreshing and reinvigorating from a flushing flow or a high flow standpoint. So that's a difficult, that's exactly where the whole rubber's going to meet the road in this situation. And so that's one of the things that I think we hope something comes from Northern on that issue coming up.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Well, I think what I hear from that is that without some level of higher flows that perform some maybe not precisely understood geomorphic function of cleaning gravels and so forth, that the system, low flow mitigation alone cannot guarantee that the system will continue in its current form, because the high flows are clearly critical for not only for in-stream habitat, but obviously for riparian condition. So I would just ask if any other panelists, to sort of wrap up here a little bit and move on to questions, if any other panelists have specific concerns about the need for high flow mitigation, and can high flow mitigation satisfy your concerns for sustaining the system in its current state. And you can answer that very generally, and it's not, don't feel like you're being, I'm trying to pin you down. I'm not trying to do that. I just am curious. I give you a chance to speak here, if anybody wants to do that. Jen?
So one thing about talking about peak flows is that the engineers want numbers from the scientists, and so the scientists provide numbers, like 1 day at X volume of flow, or 3 days of that flow. And the problem with this approach is that we create sort of a skyscraper looking hydrograph where you've got a flat base flow, and then you've got one skyscraper, and then the flow goes back down. And yet what we all know is that the river really needs to be as close as possible to the natural shape of the hydrograph. And that natural shape is not square. And so there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether, when we do run certain equations from the ecological or science perspective, that we'll be achieving, when you put those pieces together, will you really achieve what you want from the ecosystem and in those functions? So I think that the curves, the descending limb or the peak, and how that all looks, the engineers ask a lot of scientists to sort of give you answers. And from an engineering perspective, answers should work. But from the scientific perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty in the future and how this will play out.
This is a question that Save the Poudre has been addressing for a number of years, trying to imagine, is there a mitigation scenario that addresses the peak flow issue? And ultimately the conclusion that we've come to is that there isn't. The river, more than half of the river's total volume has already been diverted for other purposes. And as all the panelists here have shown, the river is in such an altered state right now that more flows would create a condition that we simply cannot engineer a solution out of and maintain the health and the functioning of the river. And so that's the position that our organization has settled on. And to quote Kelly Olson, former mayor of Fort Collins, who's been a strong advocate for the river and ecosystem health, you can't mitigate a murder. We're concerned that in the end, the river is going to be in such a depleted state that there's literally nothing that could be done to keep it functioning at the level that it is now.
So thank you for those comments. I think one thing, are these interfering here? I think Jen's point about scientific uncertainty is a really important point, and it's an issue that sometimes rightfully, sometimes wrongfully, enters into the public discussion. I think uncertainty depends on what you're asking, is how well can you predict a particular endpoint. So, and we struggle with this in the ERM, which is a probabilistic model. We don't know for sure what's going to happen at any point on the river, at any point in the future. There's a probability of things going either up or down that we have a lot more confidence in as scientists, because we are now doing more of a trajectory kind of prediction or qualitative kind of prediction as opposed to a very site-specific quantitative one. So this is just, this is the way it is, and we have to deal with that. The issue for me is that, this is really a kind of risk analysis, risk aversion kind of analysis. We can say with some certainty that we know that the river reflects its hydrographic history. Okay, what we see in the river today is the product of an integration over hydrology and climate and human intervention over the last, many decades. It's not something that just happened last year. We may cross some thresholds that cause sudden change, and there are good examples of that. So what we can say, I believe, as scientists, is that if you modify the hydrograph and you take away some of these functions that were identified here with the low flow and the high flow, and you take those away, the river will respond, and we know enough from our previous empirical work and modeling that what direction it's likely to respond in. We don't necessarily know the rate at which it will respond. And part of that is so it's sort of a societal question. How risk averse or risk prone are we given the best information that we have? Are you going to take an umbrella outside today when there's a 30% chance of rain or not, right? Or are you going to take one for the next 3 weeks because there's a front moving in 2 weeks? So we deal with this kind of uncertainty all the time. We're dealing with this sort of 21st century problem with 19th century water law, and it's creating and the city of Fort Collins and others don't really have any kind of regulatory control over the approval or not of NISP. So I think what we need as scientists, what I feel like our main objective here is to just explain to the best that we can what are the likely consequences of particular kinds of flow alterations. And it's not for us to make those decisions, but to try to persuade you to think, to assimilate that information and use it somehow in the way you think about the problem. So that was just my little stump speech here. And I would like to, unless somebody has some particular comment they want to make, then we'll open it up for a few questions.
I have one last thing. I've looked at this for a long time. I've been dealing with the idea of the potential of NISP since about 2002. And some of the people that sit on the Poudre Runs Through It group has heard me say this. This is another nail in the coffin if you're looking at it from a high flow standpoint. Is it time that we as a society or we as a group of people start talking to every diverter on the river and talk about a coordinated flow regime on the river that people during certain water years can get out of the river for 3 days and everybody's out of the river. So that gives us more water for a duration. But that duration and frequency is really important. But I think until we start to engage more people in that discussion and more groups in that discussion, this is going to be a real tough thing to crack, because it's going to take more of the water users on the system than just one to make this work.
Thank you, Ken. And Jen, I meant to ask you, the city has a new report coming out soon, I believe. Would you like to say a word or two about that?
So speaking of science on the Poudre, we've been working pretty fast and furiously on a project that we're rolling out here in the next month, and it's called the State of the Poudre River. And it's basically a current condition assessment, and the results are in the form of grades. Dan alluded to it in the River Health Assessment Framework. We set up the methods, and we established what we thought would be a healthy range for each of the metrics. And so this is like the second phase of that project. It's pretty extensive and pretty broad and in-depth. We think May 18th will be our open house date, and I would welcome you all to come see what we have found in that effort. And the idea is that we can use this as a framework for understanding the river today and then into the future.
Okay, so we do have some time for questions. People are leaving who need to leave, that's fine. We can stay in for 15, 20 minutes and have question and answers here if you would like. If you have a question, I'll ask you to come down to the front. We have limited microphones here, and I'll hand you the microphone. You can ask your question, if you would direct it to one or two panel members, and then I'll take the microphone back and we'll sort of follow up from there as necessary.
Thank you. My question has to do with river contamination. A few years ago, I think CSU had reported finding pharmaceuticals above where the canyon begins with the river. Is there a way of identifying where these things come from and a way of mitigating that problem?
Okay, thank you. Anybody want to take that one? Jen?
I'm actually going to call someone out of the audience. Jared Heath is here, and he works in this. And I don't know if you want to speak to this generally, Jared, but how would you locate the source of contamination? Jared monitors, he's out there this week actually collecting water quality samples in the canyon. So I'm going to point right to him.
So we have it, I'll come down. So yeah, I work for the Watershed Protection Program with the City of Fort Collins, and we do monitoring for emerging contaminants, mainly in the upper watershed, through a collaborative effort with Northern Water and several other entities, utilities along the Front Range that look at this. And in general, we don't see pharmaceuticals in the upper watershed. The biggest source of those, though, is below wastewater treatment plants. So we don't do a lot of that in city now, but other utilities do monitor below those, and we see pharmaceuticals and other emerging contaminants below that. So the upper watershed, the main things we see, and those emerging contaminants are mostly related to recreation. So insecticides, DEET, and stuff like that. So, but they're all in really low concentrations. Right now we're just trying to get a baseline of those because we do expect recreation and population to increase, so we want to kind of gauge where those are at. So, thanks.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? Make the long trip down.
Thanks for the information, panelists. In terms of changes with NISP and discussions on mitigation, I hear emphasis on increasing base flows, which sounds like a good thing, and I hear discussion about potentially allowing flushing flows for X days. Jen characterized it as kind of the skyscraper effect. What we're losing, even with both those attempts at mitigation, is the inundation piece. And I'm curious what your sense is on the importance of that aspect, inundation due to duration of peak. I'm talking about, I'm curious to hear the reactions of anybody who's interested in commenting about the importance of that peak to our general question about ecological health on the Poudre.
Thank you. That's a really good question. I mean, the interaction of magnitude, duration, and frequency, those all interact to shape the river, the way it is. And we scientifically still struggle a little bit with how those things get put together because we don't do experiments which, modify those things over, in combination over days, long periods. But I'm going to ask Mark to respond to that, because you talked about wetlands, and wetlands apparently require more than just the skyscraper effect that Jen was talking about. So,
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm actually going to pivot and talk more about cottonwoods, I think. I think the big issue there is, and what we're talking about here is, one of the proposals for mitigation is to send a pulse of water down the river at a high flow rate for a short time, maybe 3 days or 7 days or 1 day or a few hours, something like that, to help with some of the scouring. But one of the things that doesn't take into account is that under the natural flow regime, you get a peak, and then it slowly, the peak slowly, switch hands here to do this, I'm right-handed. The peak slowly declines, and while that's happening, the water levels in the river are slowly going down, but you also, the cottonwoods depend very much on that slow decline in the peak. They have evolved to drop their seeds around the time that the peak flows occur. Those seeds get deposited onto the riverbed as the riverbed declines, and then the cottonwood, the seedlings germinate, and then the roots essentially follow the water in the soil and the stream bed and on the banks down as the water declines. So if you have this big pulse of water that's not followed by the slow decline, you lose the opportunity for these cottonwoods to, to germinate or to successfully germinate. You probably still get a few, but you won't get anything like what you get in a natural flow regime. And there's similar sorts of impacts or similar sorts of effects in the wetlands as well too. When you have the water there, the wetlands are inundated for a long period of time, and then it slowly declines away.
well, Jen, isn't there an easy answer to that, which we saw at the McMurray Natural Area Restoration? Just lower the bank, lower the access to the river by cutting away some of the levees that have been built over time, so that lower peaks can still have access to the floodplain and, perhaps allow cottonwoods to regenerate.
Yeah, certainly. Those restoration projects are costly and hard to get started because the levees underneath that we are trying to move are they're not within our jurisdiction always and most often. And so that's definitely a goal of our program, is to lower these banks and reconnect the river at a lower level. But we can't rely on really low banks throughout this system.
Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on that? The necessity of having some kind of enduring peak flow in order to provide the functions that we have indicated up here.
Leroy, the one thing we haven't touched on much at all tonight is groundwater.
Okay.
And so the duration of those peaks certainly replenishes the groundwater further and further away from the river. And so with shorter peaks and less frequent peaks, you have in the subsequent years, you have a lower groundwater. So there's somewhat of a lag time that is seen in the groundwater further away from the river.
And without recharging that groundwater with some longer term inundation, then you have less groundwater to spill back into the river during the hot part of the year when it can be very helpful. Any other questions? Kurt, you got to do the walk.
So I'm Kurt Fausch from CSU here. I have a question for the fish biologist, Kevin Bestgen, which is, how do the fish do with the elevators in the skyscrapers? What's going to happen, especially in terms of the native fishes, with those sort of peaks of flushing flow, should they occur?
So I think it's probably linked in a couple different ways, but on different sides of the hydrograph. Those rising flows in spring are really the ones that are responsible for the fine sediment removal. That's the first thing that happens. Eventually, other physical habitat is created as as you move up the chain, the food chain, so to speak, in cobble size, cobbles move later as you get towards peak flow, so you're going to get probably less of that going on in terms of habitat development and those kinds of habitat features that fish rely on to spawn, those physical features. We wrote a paper on large wood, and so scouring flows and channel meander are important for those kinds of activities as well. Having a single peak or a single day of a high flow probably isn't going to do that much for those kinds of activities, and adding wood to the channel that really makes for complex habitat and adds a lot to fish habitat as well. On the recessional limb, I think fish get clear signals from temperature for reproduction. So changing the amount of water in the channel is going to very much change the thermal regime of the river and very much change kind of the window of time that's available for a fish in a particular thermal regime as well. So I think you're compressing reproductive schedules when you probably have impaired habitat or not enough of it. So I think that is probably a major downside to that kind of approach too. In a lot of plain streams, we have very different kinds of fishes that are producing different kinds of eggs. It gets transported way downstream because they're buoyant. They're semi-buoyant anyway. They move downstream, they repopulate reaches. A lot of dispersal goes on with early life stages of fish that may or may not happen with the pillar of flow, so to speak, dropping off to nothing. So a lot of the natural dispersal mechanisms in time for movement both upstream and downstream are probably going to be impaired. That's my off-the-cuff answer. Ken?
Well, let me just, you have a question? Okay. John?
Hi, thanks for the forum. I think this question is probably for Kevin again, or maybe Ken. And my question is around native fish. So the change in the native fish fauna that we've seen to date on the Poudre, would you attribute that more to the altered flow regime on the river or to the altered physical conditions of the river, the habitat conditions?
Yes. And I'll add one. I mean, we usually think about changes in fish communities as a function of two major things: changes in habitat, which are very much flow driven, as well as the effects of invasive species. And so changes in high flows and the kind of the general flow regimes are going to affect, and they're going to affect different components. I had a slide, and I didn't have time, but it kind of showed some of the floodplain dependent fish. So things like red-bellied dace require maybe off-channel ponds that flood flows scour and rejuvenate from year to year to make their living. So basically you're going to lose those pretty quickly as you change those peak flows and the ability to make floodplain wetlands. By constricting channels, by reducing channel meander, you reduce channel complexity, you reduce the amount of gravel in the river, you reduce backwater, so you affect things like top minnow too. So I think the habitat stuff is certainly a big effect. If you move down the river, though, you see anymore a preponderance of things like western mosquito fish and largemouth bass, bad predators on native fish, where we work on that all the time on the west slope too. And I think in terms of effects there, and maybe in the lower Poudre, non-native fishes are on par with habitat disturbance and the flow effects that go with it. So major complications and interactions, I think, as you crowd more and more fish into smaller habitat, non-native predators that these fish aren't necessarily evolved with or used to are going to have big effects. So lots of issues.
So I think in adding to your Kevin's answer, that's the same yes could be given for other ecosystem components like the riparian zone, right? Is it the reduction in peak flows, or is it the, the building of levees and the urbanization of the corridor? I think what we maybe should really keep an eye on at this point is that the ecological response model, and I think probably the state of the Poudre report, because it's based on sort of similar methods, will show, the ERM at least shows that the Poudre River ecosystem is in an impaired, stressed condition. And it's because of a variety of historical factors that we don't really understand very well how they interact over what timescales to produce the system we have now and how quickly the system may respond to new changes. But I think we can recognize that the system is in a vulnerable state right now and is likely to respond perhaps very quickly to a new flow regime. So it's not, and I'm not saying you're implying this, but it's not how did we get here, but it's really the question is where are we now and what are the implications for different management actions that, where is that going to take us in the future, and is that where we want to be? So, are there any other, I don't know if anybody has a follow-up. Ken?
To John's question, John, we've been asking that for many, many years because we have 3 sister drainages along the Front Range that are under what I sort of have to look at, and that's the Poudre, the Big Thompson, and the St. Vrain. And historically and currently, the Poudre and the Big Thompson are in very similar conditions in my mind. And the St. Vrain is, as I said earlier, is sort of that last abandon of native fish habitat. And we really haven't been able to identify why, because it has the same amount of development along the banks. It has these different things. We're not sure exactly what's functioning in that system, and that's one of the research projects that we've been working with CSU on some of those species after the flood. So those are some of the questions that we're trying to get into and answer as well.
Any other questions?
Just want to thank you guys for all being here, taking your time for the night. Kind of got a loaded question for you. I'm an ecosystem scientist, so I kind of know the systems thinking. But I guess with NIST proposal for the Glade and Gallatin, I realize they're going to lower the peak flow to fill the reservoirs. And I guess my question is, I feel like there's this dilemma with a growing population on the Front Range and trying to provide the people with water, but at the same time repairing the ecosystem health and preparing for, just say like the Hyde Park fire, for example, which totally compromised the Poudre, leaving just terrible water quality that we can't drink. So we need these reservoirs for water storage so we're not shipping bottled waters up from Denver or whatever. So where's the line in the sand that you have to draw between repairing the ecosystem and also providing the water to the people for future generations?
Thanks. That's obviously a bit of a loaded question, but I will say from one, so before asking someone to respond, what people need is always, that's negotiable, right? I mean, people need what they want and what they need, and there's needs and wants, and those are all part of the social complexity of this. What ecosystems need depends on what you want the ecosystem to look like. And if we want the ecosystem to look like it is today, we want it to remain that way, then we as scientists can explain what the ecosystem needs. But in and of itself, the ecosystem doesn't need. The need is a human-defined construct. So I think the city we want to have a healthy, sort of functioning ecosystem. That's not entirely precise, but we can at least flag what things would not contribute to that, okay? But in my mind, part of the problem is that ecosystems, if we want to maintain them, actually have hard needs. And humans also have needs, but some of those are harder than, are more, necessary than others. I don't need to have, in fact, I don't water my yard, so that's one need I don't have that other people do have. Either of you guys want to comment to that?
What part of it?
No, his question. I gave my comment.
Well, lines in the sand. With a growing population, we are going to reach a point where we are going to have to think extremely creatively about the water that we use and how we use it. And I think that point is now. We can kick that can down the road 40 or 50 years or 100 years to the point where the rivers have been completely depleted. We have 20 CFS running down the river year-round, and that'll support carp and suckers and a few other things. And up in the canyons, we'll probably have a sustainable trout population, but downstream, I don't see it. It's not a very pretty picture for me. Even though I won't be here, I'd really like it to be a different situation. I think the time is now where we need to start implementing those sorts of solutions. The Colorado Water Conservation Board put out a report, I can't remember how long ago, I think it was about 6-7 years ago, where they evaluated the sorts of things I'm talking about: water reuse, getting rid of bluegrass to the extent that we can, just going to the most aggressive conservation measures that we can to reduce our per capita water use. And what they found was that with aggressive conservation measures, we can actually meet our water use needs going forward for at least 50 years or so. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to start doing. Otherwise, the choice is we start losing our rivers. It's death by 1,000 cuts, another nail in the coffin, however you want to look at it. We're going to start seeing them blinking out along the Front Range as the water use increases. And that's where all of us get involved, because that line in the sand, those decisions are going to be made by our decision makers, by our city councils, by county commissioners, by the state legislature. It's this intersection of 1872 water law with a 100,000-year-old ecosystem that has its own demands, with a growing population and culture of water use that we imported from outside this area. All of those things are going to come into play to help us make a decision around what it is we do. And I hope that decision takes into account the needs of the Poudre River. And I just add to what Leroy said, we have to make a decision what we want the river to look like, but we also need to make a decision what we want the river to do for us. The river can do an awful lot of the things that we have to do, that we have to engineer solutions for it. We can let nature do it for us a lot cheaper and a lot easier if we just decide to work with it.
Another question?
I'd like to invoke the senior exemption of the needs.
They need to, can you come down?
I can do. How about the cost to the city?
We're filming this, so we'd like to actually, and of course, all these data are going who knows where. Thank you.
When it comes to lower flows and you've got diluting the wastewater treatment plant return waters, what kind of cost is that going to be to the city? And also, when you get the silt building up and you start getting the rotting material and your ammonia levels go up and you've got the carbon thing going on, and how's that going to affect things down the road a little bit? And on the wastewater thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that a lot of the water from the wastewater treatment plant goes up to Rawhide to the cooling pond. So if you could kind of loop that around, and how are we going to take care of that one, and who's going to pay for the tertiary treatment on the water treatment plant?
Well, that's certainly a good question, but I don't think anybody on the panel here is really qualified to that's sort of beyond the purview of our expertise here. And I noticed that the fellow from the city left after one question. Jen, you want to comment to that?
I can just say that we're keeping a close eye on, so the way this works is we have discharge permits for our wastewater treatment plants to be able to discharge water back into the Poudre River. And we're responsible then for meeting certain requirements in the river. And so with less water in the river, those discharges has a greater influence on the water quality in the river. So all I can say is that we have paid attention in the environmental impact statements to this issue, and we have commented where we have been concerned about the analyses, and we'll continue to keep a close eye on it because it's a big impact to the city fiscally if we would have to make retrofits or changes to our treatment plants on account of this. So that's definitely something that is important to us.
Well, one of the interesting things about this conversation and about the impacts or the implications of NISP is, unlike, I think, in 50, 60 years ago, there really weren't long-term considerations about building dams and water infrastructure. I think we're seeing now that there are, both from a geomorphic, from a pollution perhaps point of view, there are legitimate long-term concerns that need to be addressed in the overall calculus of whether these projects go forward in their proposed form or not. So does anybody else on the panel have a comment? At this point, we're at 8:15, and I want to, give people a chance to applaud and then leave. And if any of you have additional questions, please come down and ask individual panel members. So first, Kevin, you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I do. Public involvement is really big in this process. And now, hopefully that maybe you know a little more, or maybe you knew it all and just wanted to hear somebody else say it or something, but people listen to their constituents. And that's an important part of this process. And I think engaging, we always talk about science engagement, and can we do that or not, and can we advocate for situations or not. But I think the public, if they choose, are a powerful ally or not an ally. We've seen that in the current political climate, I think, about how powerful groups can be to sway opinion. And so if you are passionate about this, I think you should get out and do that.
And use science, not alternative facts. All right, well, let's give everyone on the panel a big hand. And we'd all like to thank each of you for coming and being concerned about the future of the Poudre River ecosystem. So thank you. Good night.